At any rate, it's nice to have the exit point to space here with us.
Well, thanks, General Sullivan, and let me add my thanks to the Association of the United States Army and all of you, our industry partners, our coalition allies and friends, and the other government and military officials that are here for your support. Sir, thanks for the opportunity to talk to this audience this morning, and it's great to be able to follow General Vi, my next-door neighbor. I've just spent more time physically next to him in the last hour than I have in the previous 3 weeks, even though our houses are side by side. But that was a great pitch. So you're going to go from something that you all know and are familiar with a discussion of logistics, to, as General Vi said, another functional command at Space and Missile Defense, where we are already organized to look at and to prepare our Army's space and missile defense forces for how we organize, man, equip, and train them. It's a task that our command is uniquely organized to accomplish. So first, where does my perspective come from? It really starts with the 3 hats that I wear. First, as the Commanding General of the Army's Space and Missile Defense Command, we organize, man, train, and equip the Army's space and global ballistic missile defense forces. Within the Army, we also serve as the specified proponent for space, high altitude, and ground-based missile defense. Second, as the Army's Space and Missile Defense Command and the Army Forces Strategic Command, we serve as the Army service component to U.S. STRATCOM. And many of the one-off kind of tasks and missions that we do generally come from being the Army's service component to that global combatant command. And then my third hat is as the commander of STRATCOM's Joint Functional Component Command for Integrated Missile Defense, which is responsible for the integration and global synchronization of missile defense systems and missile defense operations to provide that layered missile defense against missiles of all ranges and in all phases of flight. I want to talk a little bit about 2 recently published strategic documents that frame where we're going and what we do in space and missile defense. First, I think our cornerstone is the Defense Strategy, the Priorities for the 21st Century, that was released last year. There are some key points about both space and missile defense articulated in it. One says, regarding space and cyberspace capabilities we depend on, modern armed forces cannot conduct high-tempo, effective operations without reliable information and communication networks and assured access to cyberspace and space. And then speaking specifically to our homeland defense needs, it says homeland defense and support to civil authorities requires strong, steady state force readiness to include a robust missile defense capability. And then most recently, the Army published its capstone concept, which also recognizes the importance of both space and missile defense to unified land operations. The Army requires access to space capabilities to exercise effective mission command and to support combatant commanders. The Army requires leaders and soldiers who are trained to initiate and maintain access to space capabilities and who can mitigate attempts to deny, degrade, and disrupt that access. And to address the unique threats of emerging operational environment, the Army provides both strategic and theater missile defense capabilities. So those underpin what it is we do in Space and Missile Defense Command and in Army Forces Strategic Command. The capstone concept is an important document for us because it's the basis for future Army doctrine. It describes the Army's vision for the future environment and really will inform the investment strategy for force structure, readiness, and modernization. So today I'll give you my perspective on space and missile defense and what our vision is as we move forward. The Army Space and Missile Defense Forces that we have contribute to the Army's ability to shoot, move, and communicate. It's our space and missile defense forces that enable us to defend our nation and our forces overseas and our allies from limited ballistic missile attack and provide early warning to our forces in theater. As I said before, we're uniquely organized as a command to do this, but we're also multi-component, active Army National Guard and Reserve. And as General Vise said, we are also regionally aligned. As the Army looks to regionally align its forces, most of our capabilities are already regionally aligned, and we are, in fact, globally deployed around the world. And we are geographically well positioned to do the work that we're supposed to do. General Sullivan already talked about the headquarters in Huntsville. We're also in Colorado Springs. We're split between the two. And in Huntsville, we are co-located with the Missile Defense Agency, with AMC AMCOM and the MRDEC, with NASA, with the Missiles and Space Intelligence Center, and with the industry base and technology base that exists in Huntsville. In Colorado Springs, we're co-located with U.S. Air Force Space Command, U.S. Northern Command, with the part of the Missile Defense Agency that's in Colorado Springs, and with the industry base and technology base that exists in Colorado Springs. So uniquely organized and geographically positioned. We are looking at what it is we need to do to provide space and missile defense forces to prepare America's Army for its first next battle, and to implement the strategic guidance in those documents that we talked about. So in our command, we're organized around 3 lines of effort in order to perform 3 core tasks. First line of effort is in operations, where we provide trained and ready space and missile defense forces and capabilities. Those are the capabilities that we provide today. The second line of effort is capability development, where our task is to build the future space and missile defense forces and a space cadre. And those are the capabilities that we'll provide to the Army tomorrow. And then third, in material development, where we conduct space-based, laser, directed energy, and other related technologies. Those are the capabilities that we'll provide the day after tomorrow. We spend a minute talking about the Army's role in space. Some of you in this audience have heard me speak before, and so you've heard me say that the Army is the largest user of space-based capabilities in the Department of Defense. We're also a provider of space capabilities to the Department of Defense and to the Joint Warfighter. Many of the capabilities are provided by SMDCR Strat soldiers and civilians in concert with our contract workforce and our industry partners. Today, there are 2.1 satellite antennas per soldier in current operations. And those antennas provide the range of space-based capabilities from satellite communications to position navigation and timing, missile warning, weather and environmental monitoring, and space control and space situational awareness. Our dependence on space as a force multiplier will grow for this Army of 2020 and beyond. We depend on space capabilities in everything that we do, and we often don't recognize it. But whether we're getting ready to deploy, in deployment, or in redeployment, we depend on space-based capabilities, and space superiority is a military imperative. And I like to add, there's no going back. Some of you in this room will remember being in Europe during the Cold War with a Jeep and a trailer and a bunch of ammo canisters filled with 1 to 50,000 maps that we were going to scotch tape together on the move and put in a map canister or map case. I don't know about yours, but mine always slipped around inside that map case, and I never had my overlay laid on. I was never quite sure how, when I got to the end of those 1 to 50,000 maps, I was going to get rid of those, pull them. We're never going back. We are dependent on space, and we're not going back. And space enables not just mission command, but all 6 of our warfighting functions. So from an SMDCR strat perspective, what does that mean? At first, it means that Army space support teams will become regionally aligned to support our Army Service Component Commands and Joint Task Force headquarters to plug into the space support elements that are already assigned in those commands, and they'll be attuned to the unique challenges and requirements of the supported combatant commander. Our commercial imagery team will continue to provide support to the Geographic Combatant Command while being available to provide real-time commercial imagery that supports the partner capacity building of our allies and partners. We'll continue to integrate with and contribute as part of the DoD's Geospatial Intelligence Analysis Federation. Our Joint Tactical Ground Stations will provide regionally aligned, will provide SBIR stare data and direct theater missile warning, again, to our combatant commanders. And our wideband satellite operations centers will provide increased bandwidth to our geographic combatant commands around the world. And then finally, we're working with TRADOC, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but we're working with both TRADOC and FORCECOM to ensure that space is fully integrated both into institutional and unit training for the Army of 2020 and beyond. Shift to missile defenses for a second. We've been in the Army, has been a player and engaged in ballistic missile defense research and development for a long time. In fact, it was the Army that developed, tested, and integrated the key hit-to-kill interceptor and radar technologies that made possible the PAC-3, the GBI, THAAD, and the TPY-2 forward base mode radar. When Missile Defense Agency was established in 2002, material development for most of those programs transitioned from the Army to the Missile Defense Agency, but we retained responsibility for DOTMIL-PF, the Doctrine, Organization, Material, small m material, the leader development, personnel and manning, and facilities. So today, we are responsible for organizing, manning, equipping, and training our Army's ballistic missile defense elements, and for providing the range assets at Kwajalein Atoll that supports the Missile Defense Agency's missile testing, the United States Air Force ICBM testing, and other tests of that magnitude. We have 2 significant global missile defense tasks that we're currently focused on. Probably first and foremost, we are the force provider of the ballistic missile defense forces at Fort Greely, Alaska, and at Vandenberg Air Force Base with a fire control element in Colorado Springs. And that's done mostly by soldiers of the Colorado, Alaska, and California Army National Guard. They operate 24/7, 365, and are under the operational control of U.S. Northern Command. They are 300 soldiers who are defending 300 million Americans. And second, we are currently standardizing the radar detachments in our TPY-2 forward base mode radars in strategic locations around the world. They were initially forward deployed as Missile Defense Agency assets, transitioned to the Army, and now operationalizing them. And we are playing what I call DOTMIL-PF catch-up in getting those integrated into BMDS and able to employ them for the long term. The threat of a missile attack to the homeland and to our allies is real and will continue into the foreseeable future. To counter these threats, the Army of 2020 will continue to grow and evolve its missile defense capabilities. Our focus is first on homeland defense and then on regional missile defense. We are working closely with the Missile Defense Agency as we continue to test and exercise the ballistic missile defense system. As warfighters, our priorities are to maintain confidence in the current global missile defense interceptors, to gain confidence in the next generation of interceptors, to retain confidence in the regional missile defense capabilities, the SM-3 series, Patriot, and THAAD, to exercise that through C2BMC, across COCOMs and across AORs, and to explore policies and review capabilities with our allies under the auspices of U.S. Strategic Command's Nimble Titan war game. The shift to the Pacific and the continued the continued threat in the Middle East will require a greater commitment to missile defense resources, and as I believe the Army needs to seriously consider how it will meet an ever-increasing demand for more THAAD batteries and more Patriot battalions, more radars, and expanded command and control infrastructure. Now, that said, we'll never focus all of our energy and effort just on active defense, and we must also bring in offense-defense integration in order to bring balance into the missile defense fight. So operationally, SMDCR Strat, as I said, is responsible for organizing, manning, equipping, and training our space and missile defense forces. We do that, as I said, regionally aligned and globally engaged as we provide enablers to the Army to enable it to prevent, shape, and win. In operations, on any given day, we have about 950 operational forces that are U.S.-based, forward-stationed, or deployed, providing 24/7, 365 space or missile defense capability. Last year, we deployed 8 Army Space Support Teams and commercial imagery teams, which provide access to national space capabilities. We've had 78 teams that have deployed since the start of combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan. Our space professionals supported 16 major exercises, 3 mission rehearsal exercises for units deploying in support of Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan, and in support of 17 named operations around the world. Our joint tactical ground stations continue to provide early theater missile warning to combatant commanders. And we provide the satellite system experts for operational planning and the employment of our country's newest satellite communications systems, the Wideband Global Satcom, or WGS, and the Mobile User Operations System that are being employed in the fleet. There are 4 WGS satellites in operations today, with 2 more launches scheduled later this year. The plan is to ultimately have 10 WGS satellites through FY19. And we have partner agreements with 6 countries: Australia, New Zealand, Canada, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Luxembourg. In fact, we have an Australian satellite communications expert on our staff in Colorado Springs, and 11 Australian soldiers and airmen who work in our Wideband Satellite Operations Center located at Wahiawa in Hawaii. MUOS is the next generation of narrowband tactical satellite communications, which will improve beyond line-of-sight communications for our forces on the move. The first 5 MUOS satellites are in operation today. The first of the 5 is in operation today, and the second launch scheduled for later this year. These 2 satellite systems will bring increased bandwidth and capability to both the force and the fleet. Our joint friendly force tracking and commercial space-based imagery will continue to support combatant commands across the globe. We provide friendly force tracking data services to support military, government agency, and in both crisis and contingency operations. We routinely support named operations. Most recently, we supported NORTHCOM in response to the disasters of the Colorado wildfires and Hurricane Sandy. And we provide over 72,000 commercial imagery products each year and 12,000 geospatial intelligence analyst products and reports in support of STRATCOM, NORTHCOM, and the other geographic combatant commands. Most recently, our commercial imagery team were in Iraq and Afghanistan, contributing to building partner capacity with those security forces. In capability development, and as the Army's proponent for space, high altitude, and global missile defense, we're responsible for the Army's space and global missile defense doctrine. Updates to both the space and GMD doctrine will be published in FY13 and FY14. We actually host a TRADOC Institute of Excellence and provide the training for the Army's Space and Global Missile Defense Forces on behalf of TRADOC. We just recently had our fourth accreditation, went through our fourth accreditation process and scored 100% against 28 inspection standards. We are proud to be partnered with and on the TRADOC team as we train and educate our space and missile defense professionals. To that end, we actually run 200 formal courses and we train over 6,000 students a year. This year, we're looking to integrate training into the Army's institutional schools. And to that end, we are developing an Army space training strategy, working with all of the members of the community and in concert with FORSCOM and TRADOC. I envision that Army space training strategy will have three areas of emphasis. First and foremost, to increase the space knowledge across the force by incorporating space knowledge training, as I said, in our institutional training base across all of our TRADOC centers of excellence. Second is to train our soldiers and our units at home station and in the combat training centers on how to exploit the space capabilities that are available to them and to respond when they find themselves in a degraded environment. And then third, to continue to train the space professionals that we train every year in our functional area 40s. And this year we'll take on a growing role in joint ballistic missile defense training and education as our Future Warfare Center operates under the auspices of Joint Functional Component Command for Integrated Missile Defense and STRATCOM's oversight as it takes on the responsibility to lead joint BMD training. We've conducted a tactical space protection study under the leadership and auspices of the headquarters DAG 357, looking at the space-based dependencies of the brigade combat team and identifying the impacts of lost or degraded space. We are also conducting a space capabilities-based assessment and contributing to the Mission Command CBA to identify specific space gaps associated with the warfighting functions. These documents will help us identify linkages and gaps so that we can identify the kinds of capabilities that we need to develop as we move forward. In material development, our Tech Center continues to conduct space-based mission-related research and development. Last year, 3 of our programs were approved for Joint Capabilities Technology Demonstration, or JCTD. These two include enhanced communications in ISR and low-cost launch. First, SNAP, beyond line of sight communications. We have 2 prototypes in orbit today and are able to continue to communicate with one of them as we learn from them and take from them the various technologies we'll need to make nanosats a reality. The second is Kestrel I, which will improve intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. And then neither of those will be any good if we can't get them into orbit. And so our third JCTD is the Soldier Warfighter Operationally Responsive Deployer, or SWORD system for low-cost launch. You'll hear more about those from Lieutenant Colonel Pat Marshall, who talks later this morning at one of the industry talks. Another example of our material development is the Advanced Hypersonic Weapon. That a successful test in November of last year, partnered with AMRDEC and Sandia Labs, and under the guidance of OSD's Prompt Global Strike Program. It flew thousands of miles in just numbers of minutes, was remarkably accurate for a first-of-its-kind prototype, and we're working with OSD to develop a second test sometime after 2014. It's got tremendous potential as part of that global strike program. We're working with our industry partners to develop solid-state high energy in a 100-kilowatt laser system. We achieved first light of that at the solid-state laser test bed just earlier this year, and it'll lay the groundwork for future development of a mobile energy laser system with application in counter-rocket artillery, mortar, and UAS. In addition to developing technology, we're responsible for the operations of the Reagan test site at the U.S. Army Kwajalein Atoll. It's a national capable test range, and it's operated by the United States Army. It's a one-of-a-kind asset, and it supports research, development, and testing. Just last October, with many of our partners, we hosted at Reagan Test Site the Missile Defense Agency's test FTIO-1 that had 5 targets in the air, engaged 4 successfully, medium range, short range, and cruise missiles. THAAD successfully intercepting its first medium range ballistic missile, Patriot PAC-3, operating over water. It was a one-of-a-kind test that only an agency like the Missile Defense Agency could put on, and I like to add it was a kind of test that could only be hosted at a test range, a national caliber test range like the one we have at the Reagan Test Site in Kwajalein. As General Vi talked to you, no discussion here today about our space and missile defense capabilities would be complete without some discussion of the impact on the budget reductions on the force. As you know, these stem actually from 3 challenges: sequestration, the continuing resolution, and the reduction of contingency funding as it transitions into the base. It's the first 2 that have the greatest impact on Space and Missile Defense Command. And frankly, we are a microcosm of what you've heard the impact will be on the Army. Because first, it will have an impact on our operational capabilities that we provide: space and missile defense operations, our institutional training base, and our test operations at Kwajalein Atoll. When and if it goes fully into effect, it will have a potential to degrade our strategic and theater missile defense capability. It will reduce the space capabilities that we can provide to STRATCOM, and will have an impact on strategic satellite communications and theater missile warning. As a senior commander at 2 remote locations, by the way, no more 2 diverse places on the face of the earth, Kwajalein Atoll and Fort Greely, Alaska, I am also concerned about the potential for reductions in medical TDY, emergency services, and airfield operations at those locations. And as General Vi said, my biggest concern, frankly, is the angst that all this is causing in the civilian workforce. Our DA civilians facing the prospect of a furlough, and many of our contract workforce and industry partners facing even the loss of their jobs. And I go on to say this is irreversible. The angst that has already been created, even if we were to be able to work our way through this and avoid the furlough and job loss, our civilians know that that's next, whether it's next week or next month or next year. That genie, so to speak, is out of the bottle, and they know it, and it's creating angst in the workforce, and we will have to lead and manage our way through it. But you can't manage or lead a 20% reduction in pay every week for 22 weeks. You can't lead through a contract employee or a term or temp who's just lost their job. So it's the angst in the force that, frankly, is my biggest concern. So we will take those prudent measures that the Army has directed, and we'll look for ways to live within the means that are provided for us. But our priority and our focus will remain on soldiers and civilians who are deployed or preparing to deploy, so that we can provide them space and missile defense capabilities and in support of the COCOMs. So we're strategically and actively engaged across the Army in organizing, manning, training, and equipping the Army Space and Missile Defense Forces today, tomorrow, and the day after tomorrow. We'll continue to focus on providing those capabilities. We've got challenges in front of us. We'll work through those, as we implement the DoD and DA budget guidance, but I believe in the end that even throughout all of the budget turmoil, space and missile defense capabilities will continue to be ever more critical to enabling an adaptive Army as it continues its work in 2020 and beyond. And our focus at SMDCR Strat will be on providing space and missile defense forces and capabilities to the warfighter, to the Army, and to the nation. Thank you. First question, do you see a role for Space and Missile Defense Command in developing aerial platforms like LEM-V as we wind down operations in Afghanistan? Well, that's kind of a tough question. We saw a lot of value in LEM-V and aerial platforms, whether it's at 20,000 feet or high altitude platforms. LEM-V has great potential, and it would fill an ISR gap that exists today. LEM-V as a program, we learned last week, we're not going to get continued funding for that. So we are in the process of going through contract termination for LEM-V at this time, but that, in my mind, doesn't mean that there isn't a requirement for that kind of capability. We've got to be able to deliver that capability in a timely manner and obviously without the shadow of the kind of budget cuts that we're currently looking at. Long endurance multi-intelligence vehicle. It's a airship size of a football field, length of a football field, 8 stories high. Really has great promise, I think, as a technology to provide a sustained, persistent intelligence over the battlefield. Certainly good for Phase 0, Phase 1 operations, and one of the things that we'd have to work at is its operability in Phase 2 and Phase 3. But I think there's great opportunity for that kind of capability. Again, LEM-V operated at 20,000 feet, high altitude, much higher, 50 or 60,000. Certainly can meet a persistent stare capability to augment the capability that we get either with the nanosatellites that we're also developing or with the national satellites that exist today. There's no going back, but what about EMP, ASAT, cyber attack denies U.S. space? Certainly, we have got to be able to respond. We've got to recognize a degraded space environment. Like when we were growing up, we had to recognize the difference between being jammed and when our radio wasn't working. And we do need to train our forces on how to respond for short periods of time when they're in a degraded environment. There's no doubt. And that's part of the Army Space Training Strategy. My view is we can't focus on that. First of all, the enterprise, the larger enterprise that provides space capabilities, needs to remain focused on providing a robust suite of space capabilities so that we limit the amount of time that a commander on the ground is subject to a degraded space environment. And then we do have to train them on how to respond for those short periods of time when they do. And we are certainly cognizant of the EMP, ASAT threat, and cyber attack. Stratcom is very focused on ASAT, as you can well imagine, and counter ASAT capability is pretty important to us. So yes, it's a threat. Every capability that we have, bad guys are going to come up with some capability to attack it. We need to identify how we would mitigate that, but in my mind, there's still no going back to the 1 to 50,000 maps. I mean, there's always room for maps, don't get me wrong, but we're not going to replace the technology that we have today. Our kids are coming in, are growing up, that's all they know how to use, and they'll take full advantage of it. So again, enterprise needs to provide robust space capability, and we need to have programs or capability to counter the threat, and then finally to train our forces on how to operate in a degraded environment. What is the status of SMDC's Advanced Hypersonic Weapon Program? Yeah. Okay, so I mentioned that briefly in my remarks. Very successful test in November. We are operating under the auspices of the OSD's Prompt Global Strike Program. The technology that we demonstrated in concert with MRDEC and Sandia Labs was very encouraging for the program. And as a result, it's still a very viable program. And we are looking at, and again, prior to the budget implication, I haven't heard anything since, but prior to that, we were on schedule for a second test in 2014. And I think that those technologies are very real, very worthwhile, and that capability has tremendous application across any of the domains, frankly. I'm not sure what service it would eventually go to if it becomes a platform or weapon system. There's lots of uses for it, but the program is viable and still has funding today. One more question? Should have been smarter like General Vine, talk longer, and then I had less questions. How will withdrawal from Afghanistan affect our missile defense plans relative to Iran? Okay. What is your assessment of Chinese space capabilities? I probably would prefer to answer both of those in another forum and another venue, only to say that the threat of the missile defense threat in the Middle East, whether we're in Afghanistan or out of Afghanistan, I think remains problematic for us. We still have lots of forces and regional allies in the Middle East. Iran is growing a missile defense capability, and I think will continue to pose a threat to the U.S., to our forces in the region, and to our allies, and we need to be cognizant of that and attentive to it. Just like the last question about there's no going back, I think all of the other nations, the industrial nations and the developing nations of the world are increasingly reliant on space, by the way, and not necessarily missile defense, but cheap rogue missiles that drive our missile defense costs up. But the Chinese do have developing space capabilities, and we are attentive to that. And we need to understand, I mean, many of the nations on Earth are developing space capabilities for commercial and for military purposes, and we certainly need to watch that and to be attentive to it. So if no other questions, again, I'll close by saying thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. Great opportunity for me to be here and spend the day with you, and I would like to add my thanks one more time to General Sullivan at the AUSA and to all of our business and industry partners for all you do to support the soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and civilians who are serving your country today and tomorrow. Thank you very much.